This is Brother Carl Tester, and welcome to Revelation chapter 8, part 1. Chapter 8 deals with the first 4 trumpets. However, this first part is going to be introductory only before I explain the meaning of these trumpets. This first part is also going to be fairly lengthy at about 40 minutes, and I hope that you will bear with this, as my intention is to lay a necessary foundation so that we can more fully get a grasp on the meaning of these trumpets. This chapter opens the second act in the book of Revelation and follows hot on the heels of the 6th seal, which was opened in the latter part of chapter 6 and continued through chapter 7. As you know, we have seen the radical change in the Roman Empire as it converted from paganism to Christianity, and I have also commented upon the fact that the Christianization of the empire was in reality a facade for the most part, and I'll talk more about this shortly. We saw that it was necessary for God to seal his people, to mark them out, to separate them, in contrast to the mass of professing Christianity who had quickly departed from the simplicity of the gospel to another gospel, or as Paul said in Galatians 1 verse 7, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. And this is the situation the empire is now in, and great trouble is in store. So let's do a very quick recap so that we can appreciate the progression in the prophecy, and so that you can also see that nothing random or unrelated to the prophecy is being added in. This is not a private interpretation. The series of events so far is this. We have followed the loosening of the first 6 seals in chapter 6. These are all done, dusted, and fulfilled. Then we move through chapter 7, which was still under the period designated by the 6th seal. And there we saw God sealing the 144,000. God was using the time of relative peace in the Roman Empire to seal and to separate his own from the vast majority of the empire who had become Christian in name only. And now we are at the point where the 7th seal is about to be loosed. When the 7th seal is loosed, this gives way to the blowing of the 7 trumpets. Chapter 8, however, covers the first 4 trumpets only, and this is the first step to take before dealing with the 5th and 6th trumpets in chapter 9, and then the 7th trumpet in chapter 11. In this slide, you can see a timeline which clearly marks out the progression of the prophecy thus far, and now also includes the 4 trumpets of chapter 8. Note this, the first 6 seals cover off almost 300 years, but when we come to the first 4 trumpets, which we're going to look at soon, they are jam-packed into a period of about 80 years. And here we're going to see a lot of drama as 4 major historical events follow in quick succession, one after the other, and the Western Roman Empire is brought to an end. Note also this. The first 4 seals, which covered the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, had their own distinct grouping, then followed the 5th and 6th seals. The same thing occurs here again. The trumpets, the first 4 trumpets have their own distinct grouping, and then follows the 5th and 6th trumpets. God has placed a deliberate structure within the prophesied events. Now, as I see it, both the preterists and the futurists have taken this similarity and incorrectly concluded that these seals, trumpets, and vials, which we're going to look at much later, are referring to one and the same event. For the preterists, that would be the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, and for the futurists, this would be all the events occurring during their 7 years of Great Tribulation. In doing this, both the preterists and the futurists have failed to take a hold of the progressive and chronological basis of prophecy. Both the preterists and the futurists accept that the prophecies of Daniel 2 and 7 are a chronological succession of world empires, but when it comes to the book of Revelation, they throw out this basic principle which undergirds this absolutely magnificent prophecy and conclude that there is virtually no chronological progression in the 7 seals, trumpets, and vials, and they conclude therefore that they are all describing basically the same thing. And This is simply inconsistent and wrong. And I hope that as I keep progressing further through this prophecy, that you will see the great gulf that exists between the beauty of historicism and the myopia of preterism and the mirage of futurism. So let's start in Revelation 8 verse 1, and I'm going to make some comments. And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. Now I want to say this first up. When I was talking back in Revelation chapter 7, I mentioned that the first 6 verses of Revelation 8 are under the sixth seal. At least I directly implied it, and I want to correct that here as it's obviously wrong. Revelation 8 verse 1 opens with the loosening of the seventh seal. There is a similarity in the continuation of this period of peace, which I'm going to talk about, but it was incorrect for me to say that the loosening, the period of the sixth seal rolled into Revelation chapter 8. That is clearly not the case. Let's move on. In verse 2, and I saw 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. 7 trumpets are about to be blown, one after the other, and in the Bible, trumpets tell us of warning, alarm, a time of war, and the coming of judgment. As an example, we read in Joel 2 verse 1, blow ye the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord cometh, for it is nigh at hand. Zephaniah 1 verse 16, a day of the trumpet and alarm against the fenced cities and against the high towers. The trumpets are therefore telling us of a time of alarm, war, and judgment that was about to befall the Fourth World Empire, this Roman Empire of prophecy. Chronologically, as we've seen from the timeline that I had up just before, this takes us to the period following the death of Theodosius I, and we are now in the 5th century AD, and the barbarian hordes which have been hovering around the borders of the Roman Empire are about to make their move, and the consequences for the Western Roman Empire are going to be catastrophic. Under the first 4 trumpets, we will see described the 4 main waves of barbarian invasions of the Western Roman Empire, which at their conclusion turn the lights out altogether, and a third part of the sun, moon, and stars are taken out, and darkness settles on this part of the empire. This was indeed a deadly wound inflicted on the beast, but was also to become the basis for the creation of what became known as Europe, and we'll speak more about this as we progress further into the book of Revelation. Now, if the Roman Empire had indeed become Christian, why is God dealing with them in this manner? Why is God about to unleash such destructive forces on the empire that are going to virtually kill it altogether in the West? The answer to this is seen in what I have flagged previously when we followed the development of the sixth seal, and that was that while paganism and its rulers had indeed been overthrown, and the Roman Empire Christianized during the time of Constantine I to Theodosius I, this was also a time of falling away. It was the apostasy prophesied in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 3. It is the church age of Pergamos, the church married to power. The church now has access to power, position, prosperity, property, and privilege, and it was quickly corrupted. It was now fashionable and indeed a requirement to be a Christian. This was necessary to hold an office in the land. So many confess Christ, not because of any true conversion, but because it was a means to an end. The church, which I'm going to call the professing church, rapidly introduced ritual and ceremony to replace the simplicity of the gospel. The professional priest, or what is also called priestcraft, was instituted, and a hierarchical church order was developed, and so on and so on. The gospel was thus totally perverted and corrupted into what became the Roman Catholic Church. So there was nothing in the empire as a body politic, if I can use that phrase. There was nothing in the empire apart from God's sealed servant spoken of in Revelation chapter 7 that would hold back God's judgment. Now, In the next few slides, we're going to read a quote from Edward Gibbon, who, as you know by now, was a non-Christian and unbeliever, and we're going to see from his objective historical analysis of the situation, he could see the farce that Christianity had morphed into. And I think that it is an indictment against people who name the name of Christ, who cannot see things that are so obvious that even the unbeliever with no axe to grind is able to observe. As Christians, if indeed we be truly such a people, we must be honest and call out all that which is contrary to Christ without fear or favour, and to do less is to deny Christ. This quote from Edward Gibbon deals with the state of Christianity in the Roman Empire, and what makes this quote all the more relevant and of interest to the student of Bible prophecy is that it occurs chronologically in his own work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It occurs chronologically following the death of Theodosius I in 395 AD, and therefore it takes us straight to chapter 8 in the book of Revelation and gives us the setting for what is about to transpire. In his book, under the subheading Destruction of Paganism, Introduction of the Worship of Saints and Relics Among the Christians, Edward Gibbon says this: as the objects of religion were gradually reduced to the standard of the imagination, the rites and ceremonies were introduced that seemed most powerfully to affect the senses of the vulgar. If, in the beginning of the 5th century, Tertullian or Lactantius had been suddenly raised from the dead to assist at the festival of some popular saint or martyr, they would have gazed with astonishment and indignation on the profane spectacle which had succeeded to the pure and spiritual worship of a Christian congregation. As soon as the doors of the church were thrown open, they must have been offended by the smoke of the incense, the perfume of flowers, and the glare of lamps and tapers, which diffused, at noonday, a gaudy, superfluous, and, in their opinion, a sacrilegious light. If they approached the balustrade of the altar, they made their way through the prostrate crowd, consisting, for the most part, of strangers and pilgrims, who resorted to the city on the vigil of the feast, and who already felt the strong intoxication of fanaticism and perhaps of wine. Note that Edward Gibbon specifically mentions the smoke of incense, and he's speaking about this whole ridiculous system that had developed, which had succeeded the pure and spiritual worship of a Christian congregation. And we're going to see more of this from other writers. And then we're going to come to the true prayer and worship of the saints, which is acceptable to God, and this is found in Revelation 8 verse 3, and this is the background for God's judgment upon this terrible wickedness. Edward Gibbon continues, their devout kisses were imprinted on the walls and pavement of the sacred edifice, and their fervent prayers were directed, whatever might be the language of their church, to the bones, the blood, or the ashes of the saint, which were usually concealed by a linen or silken veil from the eyes of the vulgar. The Christians frequented the tombs of the martyrs in the hope of obtaining, from their powerful intercession, every sort of spiritual, but more especially of temporal, blessings. They implored the preservation of their health, or the cure of their infirmities, the fruitfulness of their barren wives, or the safety and happiness of their children. Whenever they undertook any distant or dangerous journey, they requested that the holy martyrs would be their guides and protectors on the road, and if they returned without having experienced any misfortune, they again hastened to the tombs of the martyrs to celebrate with grateful thanksgivings their obligations to the memory and relics of those heavenly patrons. The walls were hung round with symbols of the favours which they had received. Eyes and hands and feet of gold and silver, and edifying pictures, which could not long escape the abuse of indiscreet or idolatrous devotion, represented the image, the attributes, and the miracles of the tutelar saint. The same uniform original spirit of superstition might suggest, in the most distant ages and countries, the same methods of deceiving the credulity and of affecting the senses of mankind. But it must ingenuously be confessed that the ministers of the Catholic Church imitated the profane model which they were impatient to destroy. The most respectable bishops had persuaded themselves that the ignorant rustics would more cheerfully renounce the superstitions of paganism if they found some resemblance, some compensation in the bosom of Christianity. The religion of Constantine achieved, in less than a century, the final conquest of the Roman Empire, but the victors themselves were insensibly subdued by the arts of their vanquished rivals. And there we have clearly articulated the origins of the Roman Catholic religion with all of its superstitions, holy days, worshipping of and praying to saints, relics, bones, icons, and all the other nonsense which has nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity, but rather finds its origins in paganism. In time, added to all of this came the papal office, the Pontiff Maximus, the supreme keeper of the mysteries, the Pope of Rome. As Gibbon says, the ministers of the Catholic Church imitated the profane model which they were impatient to destroy, and also the victors themselves were insensibly subdued by the arts of their vanquished rivals. And as I said before, and I'll say it again, it's a great shame that when you have an unbeliever like Edward Gibbon look at the matter objectively and describe the state of affairs so plainly that such a vast multitude of people remain Roman Catholic to this very day. Perhaps even worse than this is that we have a whole array of Protestant and Pentecostal and evangelical churches again joining hand in hand with the Roman Catholic Church. Let us remember that our God is a jealous God, the Lord whose name is jealous, and he will not share his glory with another. And inasmuch as God is about to judge the imperial Roman Empire, he will also bring judgment upon every nation that will not serve him, most especially those who should know better, like our Western so-called Christian nations. In the Horae Apocalypticae, Eliot records this. Eunapius the pagan exclaimed in AD 396, quote, "These are the gods the earth nowadays brings forth, these the intercessors with the gods, men called martyrs, before whose bones and skulls, pickled and salted, the monks kneel and lay prostrate, covered with filth and dust." End quote. And then he also quotes from the Manichaean Faustus, AD 400, quote, "You have but exchanged the old idols for martyrs, and offered to the latter the same prayers as once to the former." End quote. Over a few more pages in the same book, Eliot records, says Geisler, quote, "Christians were now but seldom called upon to address their prayers to God, the usual mode being only to pray to some saint for his intercession." And as you read his book, Eliot points out that the likes of Jerome said nothing against this Antichrist spirit anywhere. Likewise, Augustine went along with it. And as we start to contemplate this, we can really get an appreciation how that the mystery of iniquity was working as it was taking its next step forward to that most dreadful beast of a system that ruled over the inhabitants of the earth for more than 1,000 years, that being the papal Roman Empire. And again, Eliot, over a few more pages, says, and so too the philosopher Coleridge, quote, "The pastors of the church," says he, "had gradually changed the life and light of the gospel into the very superstitions they were commissioned to disperse, and thus paganized Christianity in order to christen paganism." End quote. The Christians of the ante-Nicene church shunned with horror every approach to the abomination of idolatry. However, this righteous attitude did not last. And just so that you understand the terminology, this reference to the ante-Nicene church is referring to the period from the apostles of the New Testament up to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, that is the great council held by Constantine I, where I said before that we can trace much of the rot and baggage that was given to the church to that point. Now, speaking of the state of affairs either side of the Nicene Council, Eliot in the Horae Apocalypticae includes a quote from one Dean Waddington, who gives an account of the strange lapse of the professing church into reconciling paganism with Christianity. Dean Waddington says this, quote, "So definite and broad was the space which in this point separated the two religions of Christianity and paganism, that it seemed impossible that a compromise could ever be effected between principles so fundamentally hostile. Yet the contrary result took place, and a reconciliation, which in the beginning of the 4th century could not easily have been imagined, was virtually accomplished before its termination. Enthusiasm respecting the martyrs easily passed into superstition. Those who had sealed their faith by a martyr's death were exalted above the condition of men and enthroned among superior beings. Superstition gave birth to credulity. Those who sate among the powers of heaven might sustain by miraculous assistance their votaries on earth. Hence the stupid veneration for bones and relics. It was inculcated that prayer was never so surely efficacious as when offered at the tomb of some saint." End quote. As a side note, if you're not familiar with it, I recommend having a read of Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons, or The Papal Worship, proved to be the worship of Nimrod and his wife. This book gives a tremendous amount of detail showing that the Papal Roman Church is but a continuation of the old pagan Babylonian system of worship. Some have written claiming to have debunked this work, and these are but vain attempts, as you can't change the history of the whole matter. Now, you may recall when we looked at Revelation chapter 7, we spoke about God sealing his true servants at a time in the Roman Empire when the professing church had introduced its own form of sealing, being a process of ritual, ceremony, and induction that was necessary in order to be counted as one of the faithful. A similar thing is brought before us again in chapter 8. We've just heard from Edward Gibbon about the state of Christianity in the Roman Empire, and we noted his reference to the smoke of incense, the perfume of flowers, and the glare of lamps and tapers which diffused at noonday a gaudy, superfluous, and sacrilegious light. These things symbolize the prayers and offerings of that corrupted religion. This was strange fire being offered up to Mary, the saints, icons, and relics, and now, at this juncture, God again sets before us the pure and undefiled incense and prayers of the saints, which is seen in stark contrast to this abomination. We read in Revelation 8 verse 3, "And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne." The prayers of the saints here are surely the prayers of the sealed, the 144,000 spoken of in chapter 7. On the other hand, the prayers of the professing church were of the same kind as the strange fire offered by Nadab and Abihu mentioned in Leviticus chapter 10. This strange fire did not come from God's altar, the place of sacrifice, the atoning work of Jesus Christ, but rather came from men. It came from pagan religion and practice. It was not of the Holy Ghost and fire, but a substitute for the real thing. The prayers of the professing church were being made to Mary, icons, saints, and relics, and in contrast to this, the prayers of the saints are made by the Holy Ghost to God himself. And inasmuch as God slew Nadab and Abihu for their rebellion, God is also going to slay these people, and the Western Roman Empire is going to have its lights turned out before the 5th century has ended. I'm also going to take this opportunity to comment on this other angel who has the golden censer, because we will again see that this is the same person that we saw back in Revelation 7 verse 2. So I'll start from Revelation 8 verse 3, "And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. and the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. In verse 5, and the angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar and cast it into the earth, and there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. So let's again ask, who is this angel? This angel that stands and officiates at the altar. The angel that has the golden censer, the angel that has the prerogative to act in the capacity as high priest for his people and offer up their prayers before the throne. Obviously, no created angel has such authority, but Jesus Christ does. Hebrews 4, verse 14. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. So once again, as we behold the prophecy, we see Jesus Christ in action. Jesus moving in relation to the prayers of the saints, and also Jesus Christ bringing judgment upon the world. And this is a tremendous thought and a reality indeed. The Jesus Christ we are serving is not merely sitting on his throne waiting for the appointed time for him to come again at the end of this present evil age, but on the contrary, he is girded. As we saw previously in Revelation chapter 1, he's ready for action, and he has been in action for the last 2,000 years. And when I say we, I mean all those that understand these things, know this to be true, not only because we believe, but also, like unto what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 4, we say that this prophecy is not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. Or as the men who heard the testimony of the woman at the well said in John 4 verse 22, and said unto the woman, Now we believe, not because of thy saying, for we have heard him ourselves, and know this indeed is the Christ, the Saviour of the world. And so the contrast between the historicist approach to prophecy and that of preterism and futurism could hardly be clearer. Both the preterists and the futurists present an understanding of Jesus which is unable to demonstrate his mighty hand in the history of mankind. While they may well believe that God is sovereign and in control, and that's wonderful, they nonetheless can't point to anything to demonstrate this action, to demonstrate this control with spirit and with power. Whereas the historicist clearly sees the hand of God down through not only the Old Testament period, but throughout this New Testament era, and this is marked out in spirit and in power. Wonderful. Now let's talk about this silence in heaven that we read about in Revelation 8 verse 1. And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. In the first instance, let's remind ourselves that we are considering the language of the prophets, and so we are to understand that this heaven mentioned here is not the abode of God, nor is it the realm of the celestial bodies, but rather it is symbolic language used to depict that sphere of rulership and government of the empire, that is the the Roman earth of prophecy. From this we can clearly see that a short period of peace settled upon the Roman Empire. The government of the empire was seemingly at rest. Now this condition could perhaps be looking back to Revelation chapter 7 verses 1 to 3, where we previously saw the Lord Jesus Christ holding back the destructive tempest that was about to break loose on the earth. Or, much more likely, this is referring directly to the period following the death of Theodosius I in 395 AD, which ended the period of the sixth seal, and it would appear to be this event which is also the moment of the opening of the seventh seal, and this is most likely because, as we are going to see, following the death of Theodosius I, there was a very brief interlude before the barbarians had organized themselves sufficiently to attack. We previously saw that with the death of Theodosius I, the empire was divided into east and west between his two sons. This critical development also reveals another reason why the opening of the seventh seal may be considered to have taken place with the death of Theodosius I, since the fall of the Western and Eastern empires is the subject of the first six trumpets. The Roman Empire is divided at the opening of the seventh seal and is conquered during its unfolding and the blowing of the trumpets. The seventh trumpet itself, which brings with it the seven vials of wrath, deals with the ultimate fall of this fourth world empire, which is seen later on in its most dreadful form as Papal Rome. This means that the seventh seal, which is now in view here in Revelation 8 verse 1, begins with the division of Rome and encompasses its destruction in both its imperial iron and papal iron and clay forms. And so once again we have once again we have a significant historical marker to tell us where we are in the prophecy, and also, and importantly, that we are correctly following its development. This might be a little bit difficult to appreciate at this early point, but it will become much clearer as the rest of the prophecy is laid out and the interlocking nature of the whole thing is more fully revealed. So please bear with this, as it's going to be worth your while as you follow it through. What we are doing here is really like inserting a key into a lock, and the pins of the tumbler are being moved one at a time. And the further we go into the prophecy, the further the key will move into the tumbler, and it will become clear that we have the correct key needed to unlock the meaning of the prophecy. And this is very exciting, and it's going to become much clearer the further we go. When we looked at the sixth seal and followed this through into chapter 7, we saw that the century between Constantine and Theodosius was that period where the pagan Roman Empire was overcome by Christianity, but at the same time the empire was coming more and more under pressure from the nations outside of its borders. While the last emperor of this era still lived, meaning that while Theodosius I was still alive, this barbarian threat was kept at bay. And so again we read from Edward Gibbon of this threatening tempest that was being held back for a time on the frontiers of the empire. Edward Gibbon said, "The threatening tempest of barbarians, which so soon subverted the foundations of Roman greatness, was still repelled or suspended on the frontiers." We note the words that Gibbon uses. He's unwittingly employing the very same language as Revelation chapter 7, which spoke of the four winds of the earth being held back. Edward Gibbon continues, "The correspondence of nations was in that age so imperfect and precarious that the revolutions of the north might escape the knowledge of the court of Ravenna, till the dark cloud, which was collected along the coast of the Baltic, burst in thunder upon the banks of the upper Danube." Here the historian likens the barbarian stirring in the north to the collecting of a dark cloud along the borders, ultimately bursting like a storm upon the empire. And it is also noteworthy that this is the direction from which comes the cold weather and hail in this part of the world. And when we get to it, we're going to see that the very first thing that is said of the first trumpet is that it was like unto hail. And this is simply amazing. This historian unwittingly bears witness again and again to the fulfillment of the prophecy. So I ask, why do we need to look anywhere else? In detail after detail, point after point, the fulfillment of the prophecy is plain for all with eyes to see, and there is nothing like this to be found in any other approach to Bible prophecy. The main contenders of futurism and preterism are shown to be no contenders at all, but rather pretenders. Now Edward Gibbon speaks about the time of the death of Theodosius I, and he says this: "If the subjects of Rome could be ignorant of their obligations to the great Theodosius, they would too soon convince how painfully the spirit and abilities of their deceased emperor had supported the frail and mouldering edifice of the Republic. He died in the month of January, 395 AD, and before the end of the winter of the same year, the Gothic nation was in arms." And this is the period of the opening of the seventh seal, where there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour, just a very brief interlude with the opening or loosening of the seventh seal before the devastating Gothic invasions commenced. Now here again we see the list of Roman emperors which are within the time frame we have been looking at, and that is from Constantine I to Theodosius I. Now we need to appreciate that it was not that all war had ceased during this period, as when Constantine I came along, he had to fight several battles in order to bring the empire together under the banner of Christianity. And in doing so, he was able to bring stability to the empire and a degree of prosperity. And this basically lasted until the time of the death of Theodosius I. Also, we need to understand that during this period, at the time of Valens, Gratian, and Valentinian II, great battles were in fact fought with the Gothic nations at the borders of the empire. This particular time, 375 to 378 AD, marked a significant change in the fortunes of the Roman Empire, as it was due to this that the Gothic armies were able to subsequently overrun and overthrow the Western Roman Empire. Howbeit, this was deferred while Theodosius I was alive, but following his death, as we have seen, there was a very brief lull, and then all bets were off and the Gothic armies burst like thunder upon the Western Roman Empire. In the decades just before the final overwhelming barbarian invasions occurred, the threat was already being likened to the sounding of war trumpets through the empire. Here we have a quote from Ammianus Marcellinus, who lived between 330 and 400 AD, and he was a Roman soldier and historian. He was also a Greek from Antioch, so I believe. And he said this: "At this time it was as if the trumpets were sounding the signal for the battle throughout the Roman world. The most savage nations arose and poured across the nearest frontiers." So once again, we can see the descriptive terms of the historians fitting in beautifully with what is presented to us in the prophecy. In the book Early European History by Hutton Webster, we read this: "Until his death, the Goths remained quiet, but it was only the lull before the storm. Theodosius, the friend of the Goths, died in 395 AD, leaving the defense of the Roman world to his weakling sons, Arcadius and Honorius." And so the prophecy states that there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. The four angels who had been commanded to hold back the tempest were now allowed to blow their trumpets one after the other. The time had come once again for God's judgment to come forth, and that's a sobering thought. Now, before I wrap up this introduction, what has become a rather lengthy introduction, and get into the meaning of the trumpets, we need to take a look at the Roman Empire at the time of Theodosius and the years immediately following his death, in order to understand why it is that the trumpets specifically refer to a third part, time and time again, as this will give us a better appreciation for the meaning of the prophecy. Now, the maps that you will see show approximate boundaries only and are for illustration purposes. And so we can see here the extent of the Roman Empire before the death of Theodosius, and it's clearly still vast, stretching from Britain through Europe, Asia Minor, the Middle East, and North Africa. As we know, the seat of the empire had been transferred from Rome to Constantinople by Constantine in the century before Theodosius. Constantine built a new imperial residence at Byzantium, and this was initially called the New Rome in 324 AD, but it was subsequently renamed Constantinople in 330 AD after Constantine himself. So Constantinople was then the capital of the Roman Empire from 330 to 395 AD, after which time the empire was divided, and then it continued as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or what became known as the Byzantium or Byzantine Empire, until 1453, when it was overtaken by the Ottomans. And also when the empire divided, Ravenna, which is now shown, became the seat of the Western emperors, and it was the capital city of the Western Roman Empire from 402 until the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD. Now for some additional background information. With the blowing of the trumpets, starting with the first, we need to understand that the Roman Empire had a tripartite division at the time. Also, twice before this, the Roman Empire had been divided into three parts. Firstly in 311 AD with Constantine, and then later in 337 also. When we come to the time of Theodosius, not only is the empire split between East and West, as can be seen in this slide, but between the two was a third part of the empire known as the Illyricum Prefecture, which had become occupied by the Goths and over which they held a de facto rule, although it was ostensibly still part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Eliot states in the Horae Apocalypticae that due to the Gothic occupation, the Illyricum Prefecture had become so detached from the rule of both East and West that its fortunes were not involved with either part. Now, the reason why I am bringing this to your attention is simply this. Revelation chapter 8 mentions the third part over and over again, and we need to understand that it was not the entire empire that was going to unravel with the trumpets, but only a third part. And in relation to the first four trumpets, that third part was to be the Western Roman Empire. Also shown in this slide are the Huns, and they have been instrumental in pressuring the Goths, who in turn have been making inroads into the Roman Empire, and so there's a lot of friction between these different parties. The Goths and the Huns are the key agitating powers that caused the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, as we shall see. So here in this slide is highlighted the Western Roman Empire, and it is this area which is the subject of the first four trumpets. Later, when we come to the fifth and sixth trumpets, we're going to see that they deal with the eastern third of the Roman Empire, and we will get to this much later. And that brings me to a close of the introduction to Revelation chapter 8, and with that foundation laid, I'm going to go on to the next part, chapter 8, which deals with the first four trumpets, and then we'll get into Revelation chapter 9, which deals with the fifth and sixth trumpets.